Hello, welcome back to this breakdown of Carl Schmitt's Land and Sea. In this part, we're going to go over spatial revolutions or revolutions in space, transformations in human consciousness, which come about spatially, we could say. So, what does Schmitt mean by this? So he says, he quotes, the human receives a particular historical consciousness from his space, which is subject to great historical transformations. So in the earlier sections, we were going over contentions between land powers and sea powers and the innovation of naval technology. And of course, the innovation of naval technology has deeply altered our capacity to move around. Well, we could say that the innovations in land technologies have done the same, but I think that the naval technologies have really done more in this regard. So in the earlier sections, we were talking about the transformation from, for example, medieval seafaring to which was more coastal seafaring, to the kind of North European seafaring with the moving out into the Atlantic and so forth, which was more open ocean seafaring. That's one example of a change in the kind of spatial movement and spatial consciousness of a people's. In this introduction of this idea of spatial consciousness, and he says, the varied forms of life correspond to equally differentiated spaces, even within the same time period. The environment of individual humans for the practice of daily life is already defined differently by their different life occupations. An urbanite thinks the world otherwise than does a peasant farmer. A whale fish hunter has another living space, Lebensraum, than an opera singer. And to a pilot, the world and life appear otherwise not only in other lights, but also in other quantities, depths, and horizons. The differences between spatial conceptions are still deeper and greater when it is a matter of different peoples and different periods of human history. So it's not just it's not just history. Like, for example, European peoples in the medieval era versus in the early modern era. It's not just different times. It's also just within the same time period, it's different people, different places, and their understanding of space being fundamentally different. He mentions the urbanite versus the peasant farmer. That reminded me a little bit today of cultural and political tensions between, particularly in the US. This seems to be more of an issue in the US than Europe, although I think in Europe it's somewhat of an issue as well. But particularly in the US, you have what we call on Twitter shit libs, like urbanite shit libs, versus people that make up, in particular in the US, people that make up the kind of Midwest area. So they're not living in these big cosmopolitan urban cities. They're living in, it's not necessarily that they're all living like peasant farmers or anything, but there's definitely some sort of spatial difference between living in, I don't know, like my U.S. geography isn't great, Mississippi versus the place Breaking Bad is filmed, not Arizona. Is it Arizona? I don't know. Look, my American geography isn't great, but you know what I mean, like the flyover states, as they call them, versus New York, San Francisco, these coastal metropolis cities. There's clearly political and cultural tensions there, which aren't just defined by class, although class is certainly part of it, but by space as well. It's also been observed that in Europe, in particular, a lot of the cultural political tensions often express themselves through movements which are somewhat referenced to transportation, like the Yellow Vests in France. People that value their transport more. people that maybe don't work online as much. There's a kind of elite, it's kind of liberal elites, well-paid white-collar type, who's likely to live in a nice city where everything's conveniently walking distance from them, versus someone who lives in the outskirts or somewhere further away where they have to drive to get places or to get anything or to get to work, to get shopping, to visit friends. And this, it kind of expresses itself in a sort of cultural and political tension. So I won't introduce the element of the internet yet, because that's obviously, like, for our time, the big spatial transformation is the internet. Look at my work on Paul Virilio, you'll see that like how important this is. But I won't jump into that here. But basically, Schmitt's main argument here is that differences in how we occupy and use space in our day-to-day lives, and differences historically, transformations historically over time, are fundamental to our cultural and political reality. Schmitt makes a larger point here about the history of understanding space and the kind of distinct specialization. We have all these specialized ways of understanding space, and we have no unifying theory of space. And perhaps this is one of the reasons that we're getting into these contentions between land powers and sea powers, between shitlib urbanites and people in the outskirts or the flyover states or whatever that equivalent would be in Europe. You have these life worlds, I suppose, to use the word Lebensraum, these kind of life spaces or life worlds, which are make up our consciousness as peoples, political peoples, as cultural peoples, as national peoples, and so on and so forth. And we don't really have an understanding of this. What we're left with through modern thinking about space is a bunch of specialized areas which are kind of unrelated to each other, or seemingly unrelated to each other, with no unifying frame for them. So Schmitt will say, in modernity, the different sciences also worked out their separate spatial conceptions with increasing specialization. Geometry, physics, psychology, and biology here go their own ways, diverging widely from one another. If you ask the learned, they shall reply to you that mathematics space is something wholly other than the space of electromagnetic force field, and this space again is wholly different from space in the psychological and biological senses. There are half a dozen concepts of space. Here, any unity is lacking, and the danger lurks that the great problem will be defrayed and destroyed by too much talk through the unrelated coexistence of different peoples. Even the philosophy and epistemology of the 19th century gave us no comprehensive, simple answer to the great question of space, and in practice left us in the lurch. So we've been left in the lurch. And interestingly, I think this is completely verified, because this is, Schmitt is kind of a interwar philosopher, kind of mid to early mid 20th century, and late 20th century. Then you have the emergence of philosophers like Paul Virilio, for one. Peter Sloterdijk is another example. People in late 20th century, early 21st century thinkers, which are increasingly incorporating spatial philosophy into their work. So you can see that this lurch we've been left in is kind of being compensated for now. That gap has been filled, somewhat due to the internet and the complete spatial disruption which the internet has caused. Think of the pod. Think of lockdowns when we were all confined to these little domestic emergency state domesticity, we could even call it. So yeah, this is I think this was an observation which turned out to be extremely accurate by Schmitt. So there's an interesting quote here by Schmitt. He says, "Then there emerges new measures and directions of political and political historical activity, new sciences, new orders, new life, or reborn peoples. The expansion can be so deep and so surprising." So here he's referring to changes in spatial consciousness, particularly from an expansive perspective. The expansion could be so deep and so surprising that not only quantities and measurement, not only the outermost human horizon, but even the structure of the concept of space itself is altered. Then one may speak of a spatial revolution. So he's not just talking about changes in, for example, technologies in which we can, travel quicker or travel faster. He's also talking about kind of fundamental shifts in the concept of space itself, which occurs through these transformations. Now, there's an interesting question here, which is like, the general enlightened kind of scientifically orientated history will say something like, we discovered the Earth was not going around the sun. Sorry, the sun was not going around the Earth, but the Earth was going around the sun. We discovered how to fly planes. We discovered whatever, countless examples. Scientific discovery just happens, and then we just start using these technologies, and then that causes all sorts of changes. Where I think Schmitt's conception here is less clear-cut, materialistic, and scientifically determined. His conception would be, I think, would be something about space being kind of fundamentally political, and changes in political consciousness, changes in geopolitics, activities which might which we could frame as conquests or expansions. These sort of happen on their own merit. Now, they're not completely unrelated from technology. They're not completely unrelated to science, but they do happen somewhat on their own merit. They're not completely predetermined by technology or predetermined by science. They happen on their own merit, and then through this, we see changes in science, culture, and so forth. So one of the examples he gives is Alexander the Great. He says, in Alexander the Great's maneuvers of conquest, a powerful new spatial horizon opened to the Greeks. The culture and art of Hellenism is its consequence. Aristotle, the great philosopher, a contemporary of this spatial transformation, already saw that the human inhabited world drew itself ever more together from the east to the west. The city of Alexandria on the Nile, founded by Alexander, became a center of astonishing discoveries and inventions in the technical, mathematical, and physical domains. Here, Euclides found the Euclidean geometry, found the school of Euclidean geometry. Archimedes of Syracuse, an inventor of great war machines and discoverer of natural scientific laws, studied here. And the director of the Library of Alexandria, Eratosthenes, had already correctly calculated the equator and the spherical shape of the Earth. Thus, the doctrine of Copernicus was anticipated in advance. Nonetheless, the Hellenic world was not comprehensive enough for a planetary spatial revolution. Its knowledge remained the concern of the learned because it had not drawn a world ocean into its existential reality. So you see here in this example of Alexander the Great that the expansion and conquests came first, and then the scientific discoveries came after that. This is kind of contradictory to the common wisdom of the Enlightenment and of the modern world, which is that discoveries happen not by conquerors, discoveries happen or within the expansion and conquering activity, but they happen through intelligent men running around with test tubes and calculators and so forth. This is a very different story that we're getting told to us here. Next he mentions Caesar. He says, when from Rome outward, Caesar conquered Gaul and England. 300 years later, the Atlantic Ocean was reached and the view of the Northwest was opened. This was the first step towards the contemporary spatial conception of Europe. In this first century of the Roman imperial period, most strongly indeed at the time of Nero, the consciousness of a deep transformation became so powerful and expansive that one can only speak of a spatial revolutionary transformation, at least with the leading intellects. The historical moment coincides with the first century of our era and thus merits particular attention. The field of vision expanded to the east and to the west, to the north, to the south. Wars of conquest and civil wars enveloped space from Spain to Persia, from England to Egypt. Widely distant regions and peoples came into contact with each other and experienced the unity of a common political destiny. From all parts of the empire, from Germany and from Syria, from Africa and from Illyria, a general could be elevated to emperor in Rome by his soldiers. So we have here within this spatial expansion also the creation of a common political destiny. Again, very important because we're also here viewing space as incorporating peoples into a shared political destiny. We're not just speaking of we've invented technologies which bring us from A to B, so now we can trade with these people. Or now we know abstractly that this is a place we didn't know it was before, so put it on the map, kind of thing. This this isn't just a kind of prudish scientific discovery. This is an incorporation into a shared political destiny. Okay, so to me, this is one of the most interesting observations he makes. Is about the Dark Ages and the Crusades. He says the fall of the Roman Empire and the expansion of Islam, the invasions of the Arabs and the Turks brought about a centuries long spatial darkening and land confinement in Europe. Being pushed from the sea, the lack of a fleet, and the complete confinement to land are markers of the early Middle Ages and its feudal system. In the period from 500 to 1100, Europe became a feudal agrarian landmass, the ruling class of which, the feudal lords, ceded intellectual and spiritual culture, even reading and writing, to the church and to the clerisy. Famed rulers and heroes of this period could neither read nor write. For this, they had a monk or a chaplain. In the Sea Empire, the rulers probably could not have remained ignorant of reading and writing for so long as they could in such a purely land-bound agrarian economic remnant of power. As a result, the Crusades, however, French, English, and German knights and merchants became acquainted with the Near East. In the north, the expansion of the Germanic Hanseatic League and the Teutonic Knights opened up a horizon. Here, a system of traffic and trade emerged, which came to be called the world economy of the Middle Ages. Okay, so you have Europe's history of expansion, and then the Dark Ages. So, for example, the Hellenic expansion, the Roman expansion, and then the Dark Ages is marked by a confinement, loss of access to the Mediterranean due to the encroachment of Arabs, Muslims. As we know, Spain was conquered. Most of Spain was conquered by the Arabs at one point, and so on. You have this land confinement, and then with the Crusades, you have a kind of reaction against the land confinement, because when was the Crusades? Well, it was around 1100, right? It started around 1100. So you have this pushback and expansion into the Near East, Jerusalem, and so on and so on. So there's this kind of tension and dialectic between expansion and confinement, which we're also understanding here. Again, sort of reminded me of today a little bit, because we have a sort of confinement, I think, occurring in the West through, well, it's kind of more technological. It's technological as much as geopolitical. Geopolitically, with the American empire is receding back from controlling the seas, and then you have encroachments from other peoples, which does affect Europe as well. For the Houthi rebels at the moment is a good example of this. Other The loss of Western influence over naval routes seems to be, according to Schmitt, consistent with what we historically have understood as a dark age. So a dark age is a confinement period. But then this dark age is also going to end up with a, not inevitably, but it could end up with a rejuvenation and an expansion, which is what the Crusades were. It was a reaction to a confinement. So finally, within this history of spatial revolutions, we have the discovery of America. And you should note the discovery of America is distinct because it signifies the discovery of open ocean Atlantic travel rather than coastal inland Mediterranean travel, which to Schmitt I think is more of a kind of land-based travel. You know, the Crusades were more of a utilizing the Mediterranean, but they were more of an expression of land power expansion, which utilized the Mediterranean, just as Rome was and just as Alexander the Great was. So, finally, you have the discovery of America, and discovery of America is distinct because it also incorporated into it what he calls a planetary spatial revolution, which incorporates the circumnavigation of the world. The discovery of America and the circumnavigation of the world are sort of understood as the same activity. They're the same event. So now we have planetary spatial revolution, and this is a whole different ballpark we're in now.